What's a rule that was implemented somewhere that massively backfired? Worked for a warehouse 4 days a week, 11 a.m. to 9:30 p.m., Monday to Thursday. They reiterated many times during the interview process that overtime was optional. My first day, my supervisor told me that overtime is indeed optional, but if you don't stay for overtime, then everybody else has to stay even later. So if you do leave on time, don't come back, was the overall message. Whatever, I didn't mind the extra hours too much, although a 10.5 hour shift is already long, but the bonus was that we could go early if all the orders were done. As you can imagine, the good workers busted their butt from start to finish, cutting as many corners, good and bad ones, as they could in order to get out early. Normally, this ended up with us being able to leave around 15 minutes or so early on a really good day, where the stars aligned and everybody showed up. We could leave as early as 7:30 or 8. However, leaving that early only happened once or twice a year at most. Overtime was every week. Every single Monday, we would work until 2 a.m. 11 a.m. to 2 a.m. isn't ideal when you have no idea when you're even off. At around 7 p.m., we'd start to get an idea if we're in for another hour or another 6. One of the genius new hires mentioned to the boss in the office how he was hoping to get out by 6. Oh, good. Apparently, the boss was thinking us leaving early was a common occurrence now and decided that nobody was going to be leaving early anymore. Sweep or dust or whatever, but nobody leaves until 9:30 at the earliest. All of a sudden, we were late every single day without fail. Why? We were working our butts off to get out early but failing every day and ending up on time or still late. By taking away our ability to leave early, everybody gave up working hard. Slow down, we've got another hour left anyways. I'm not sweeping, I'm not doing this, I'm not doing that. Went from 45 hours a week to 55, 13 hours every day. Nobody ever left early anymore, but nobody left on time either. Losses for everybody involved because the boss didn't realize that us leaving early for 2 days out of a year actually gave us the daily motivation to work our butts off for the other 363. Too long didn't read. Boss put a stop to leaving early. No incentive to work our butts off anymore means paying overtime every day. Story 4. No card games at school. When I was in elementary, middle school, Magic the Gathering and Pokemon card games were pretty popular. Almost all of the guys played and would get together after lunch to play before classes started again. Here is where it's important for me to mention that this was a Christian school. It probably didn't take long for a teacher, administrator, or helicopter parent to wonder what all the fuss was about. Sure enough, one of them probably got a hold of a MTG card, saw the art depicting a demon, and decided that this had to be the work of Satan to warp our young minds. Almost overnight, all trading card games were banned from school. Any cards would be confiscated until the very end of the school year. Well, you now have several dozen prepubescent boys with about 30 minutes of free time and nothing to do. So we did boy stuff. We ran around, pushed each other, fought, went places we weren't supposed to, just overall got into mischief. All this time, they had a free babysitter that was keeping us all engaged, quiet, and civil, all while reinforcing quick math skills and teaching multi-level problem solving. The next year, we got a new administrator and card games were allowed at the school again. Story 6. Strip joints in Alberta, Canada are an interesting example of this. Believing that strippers and strip clubs were the root of all things wrong in the world, the Citizens for Decency, led by Audrey Jensen, sprung about in Alberta in the 1980s. They pushed for legislation that would create an invisible, imaginary buffer zone of 1.5 meters or something around exotic dancers to protect them from patrons and pervs in the row. This barrier would become facilitated in some clubs with an odd little railing or other physical means. But most bars I've seen in Alberta don't have any actual physical barriers. At least not anymore. Maybe there were more intrusive blocks and partitions when the law was new. The result of this protective measure was, and still is, that patrons can no longer hand $5 bills, 20s, etc. to the dancers. They cannot tuck a bill into their undies or crawl on stage with the bill in their mouth to have it snatched away. Instead, in Alberta, strip club patrons throw dollar coins at the dancers. Typically, this comes after their dance when the dancers go around posing on their knees, etc., with their personal posters rolled up to improvise a cone. Customers throw their loonies at the cone and then it's funneled through her private parts. Other versions of this is the dancers will lick a loony and stick it to their butt cheeks, and the game is to throw your loonies to try and knock it off. Winners get a little fridge magnet, signed poster, and a keychain, etc. Once the coin toss games are over, the dancer will then return to the stage with a large magnet on a leash and drag it around collecting her hard-earned medal. She'll intermittently scrape the loonies into a beer jug as they accumulate and continue dragging the magnet around. I should say that some folks still prefer to keep it classy and use larger bills, but it's about 1 in 20. So to recap, the goal was to protect the safety and dignity of dancers. The result is the dancers have become reduced to fleshy coin toss targets. Oh, Canada, come on. Be better. That's such a ridiculous solution. The fact that it even went on past a day. Like, oh, this is getting a little violent. I tell you what, dude, those loonies and toonies hurt. I've never been a stripper, I would like to clarify that, but I have been hit by the coin more than once. It's a long story. Story 7. My agency just implemented this yesterday. We had recycling waste baskets at each desk for paper and a regular one for trash. My floor has about 75 people on it. On floor 25 of a 32-floor building. Floors below us have about 170 people. So they removed the individual baskets from each desk, and now if I want to dispose of a single sheet of paper, I have to walk to the lunchroom area or the copy room. This will be a huge waste of time, as people are just going to throw paper out in the trash. This is their way of being aggressive in terms of recycling. I don't see how this makes things easier or more conducive to recycling. People are just going to put more paper in the trash. Edit. And they only have on bin for paper in the lunchroom and one for bottles and cans. We used to have 3 for bottles and cans in the lunchroom. There is one in the copy room too, but it's not nearly enough. Story 8. The beach club I worked as a cabana boy had decided one summer to buy $40,000 worth of club umbrellas. The old system was that you, as a cabana boy, had 30 to 60 families who you took care of in exchange for tips. One of your responsibilities was to carry whatever heavy beach equipment they brought, Tommy Bahama chairs and umbrellas, from the cabana to the ocean and set it up and then carry it back up to the cabana at the end of the day. If you left chairs or umbrellas on the beach, the club supervisors would charge you $1 per item because they would have to carry it to avoid the stuff from getting washed away, broken, or stolen by locals, etc. It was a pretty fair and workable system. The new system was that members still had their own chairs but would request a number of umbrellas from the cabana boy. Obviously, they requested way more than they would ever need or buy themselves, and the club umbrellas were extra heavy and exhausting to set up. We complained to management about this and a lot of other stuff, and they basically just said, F you, to us, and well, that didn't exactly inspire us to do them any favors, considering most of our pay came from the members. Since all the umbrellas looked the same, we would just take the chairs and leave the umbrellas on the beach so no one would know who was supposed to be responsible for picking them up. The supervisor simply couldn't get them all, and almost all of them wound up broken or missing by the end of the summer. Whoops. Story 9. Well, Harvard implemented a rule that bars students who are members of single-sex campus organizations from being leaders in other student life aspects, captains of a sport team, student government, etc., as well as stop them from being able to receive a letter of recommendation from a college dean for a postgraduate fellowship. Harvard claimed the reasoning behind it was to curtail the power of secret societies like the Skull and Bones group, and because all male fraternities have issues with SA. Except the rule now discourages students from joining any single-sex organization. Pan-Hellenic sororities, the multicultural Greek organizations, namely the Black fraternities and sororities, a woman in STEM club, an all-male a cappella group, those all count as single-sex organizations. Members of groups that have no outstanding issues are being punished for the poor behavior of a few all-male groups. They're now being sued by a number of sororities and fraternities. Story 10. I used to work at a semiconductor lab, looking for defects in computer chips with an electron microscope. The work is complicated, precise, and easy to F up. One wrong move and the sample is a toast. A lip, lost in processing, as they say in the biz. Management got really angry at lips and started clamping down really hard on technicians who did them. If you effed up a sample, you got written up. Simple as that. The problem is that not all jobs are created equal. Some jobs are really easy, and other jobs are really hard and risky. So, the smart technicians started taking all of the easy jobs, and the idiots who didn't know any better started taking all of the hard jobs. The lip rate then skyrocketed, and it created a really contentious atmosphere in the lab of people screwing each other over to take the easier jobs. Morale plummeted, and people started leaving to go to other groups that weren't crap sandwiches. This drove lab output down even further. Story 11. I work in manufacturing and we get paid piece rate. So the more I run, the more I get paid. We also have a base hourly pay rate of $10 an hour. So whichever pays more, the hourly or the piece rate, is what we get paid for the day. On bad days, sometimes they bump us up to 12 hours for the day, and when we train new people, we get paid 15 hours to compensate for having to slow down to stop our machines and teach the new people. The big boss, and I'm talking my boss's boss's boss, came in last week. Now, he used to work on the line like I do now, but you can tell he's living comfortably in his corporate life and has forgotten some of the bad parts of this job. He told my boss that we are to no longer receive training pay because, by his logic, if we are working with someone, we should be making more than 15 hours anyway. And these past 3 weeks or so, we have been doing a lot of training, so a few of us got together at the end of the day and agreed. If they aren't paying us, we're not training people. We will teach the new people enough to make some money and leave the training to be designated for trainers. 2 people split between 15 or so new hires, but they make $17.50 an hour. The policy lasted all of 4 days. Story 12. It was a temporary rule, but it still makes me laugh. One time, both of our chemistry analyzers went down during the day shift in a level 1 trauma center. We could still run a few electrolytes and blood gases, but that's all. So we asked the house supervisor to send a message out to all the providers explaining the situation. That chemistry is down and we won't be able to run any of the normal tests until we back it up. And that sucks, but there isn't anything we can do until the engineer gets here and fixes our analyzer. So just be patient and we'll get caught up when we can. But if you send us any routine chemistry testing, it won't get done. What she ended up saying was, please don't order routine chemistry testing until further notice. LOL. So what did the providers do? They just kept ordering everything as stat, and based off her alert message, I do not blame them. Story 13. At the company I used to work for, we had a couple of big trade shows per year that we went to, where most of the staff attended. For a long time, the rule was that you could be reimbursed up to $30 per day for meals. You just had to turn in receipts afterwards. Well, inevitably somebody, let's call him Mike, since that was his name, decided that he would spend his per diem every day for a week on cocktails and turn those receipts in. He got reimbursed, but there was a new policy implemented. From there on out, you could only submit 2 drinks per day for reimbursement. I think you can probably figure out where this is going. Some fought the rule by simply going to dinner late, getting their check before the clock struck midnight, then opening a new tab immediately, allowing them to have more than 2 drinks on the company in a single sitting. But that was for amateurs, since the rules didn't specify your receipts had to be from some kind of restaurant, as people would often go to the grocery store to buy snacks, protein bars to nosh on during the day if they couldn't grab a lunch, and whatever else. Turns out that you can get 2 big 2-liter plastic bottles of bottom shelf liquor at the store and order off the value menu at McDonald's drive-thru for less than $30. Alcoholism intensifies. Story 14. When I was in middle school, a girl in my class fell down the stairs and broke her arm. She was one of those girls who was always somehow sick or hurt, so I didn't believe her. But most of the administration freaked the F out about it. Their theory was that the fall was due to too much aggression in the hallways and on the stairs. There were probably 150 kids in my middle school and only 2 sets of stairs. We were all in the 2nd floor of one building. It was very crowded. As soon as the bell rang, everyone would run out and flood the hallways and try to push and shove their way to the next class as violently as they had to. It was Catholic school, so we were penalized if we were late, and they were pretty freaking strict about it. Anyway, for some reason, they actually thought that if they put a red piece of tape down the length of the hallway, everything would be fixed. They designated one set of stairs for going up and the other for going down. One side of the line went one way, the other went the opposite way, like it was a road and we were cars. If your classroom was 4 steps away or directly across the hall, you couldn't just walk to it. You had to go all the way around the line with all 149 of the other middle schoolers trying to push and shove their way in front of you or around you. We weren't even allowed to step on the line. We could get written up for that alone. They called that a getting an infraction. It was the same penalty if we were late to class. Obviously, this backfired pretty severely. Not only did tardies skyrocket, I'm pretty sure there were more injuries as we frantically pushed and fought each other. The line was mercilessly ridiculed. People would push their friends onto it so they would get in trouble for touching it, or push them across the hall so they were forced to circle the perimeter all over again to get to class. Eventually, the boys started riots or protests, whatever you want to call them, where they'd gather in the hallways and push through in a straight line, forcing traffic to all go in one direction. line or not. One day we had a planned protest and started running zigzags over the line, up the downstairs and down the upstairs. We got in trouble, of course, and some kids got hurt. But participating in that was a lot of fun. That was right before spring break, and when we came back, the line was gone. I guess they finally realized that it was bad and potentially dangerous of an idea. I mean, there's only so much you can do for middle schooler chaos, you know? You can try in traffic and make sense of it, but they're kids. There's 150 of them. It's gonna get a little rowdy. However, we kind of just glossed over the fact he's like, yeah, she broke her arm, in quotes, but I don't believe her. Like, did she? Was there a justified reason for them trying this? We have no idea. Story 15. On a road trip somewhere in California, I discovered that semi-trucks by law are required to travel at 10 miles per hour below the speed limit for everyone else. Might not seem like a huge deal, just go around them, right? Well, if it's an arterial highway and a lot of semis come up this way and there's only 2 lanes, congratulations, legislators! You managed to engineer a 1-lane highway, and the most frustrating one ever. So you've got 2 lanes. One is a long line of cars, but the other lane is empty, so you zoom down it wondering why no one is using it until you get behind the semi and realize you're going to be stuck going 55 unless you get over. So you signal to move in. The long line of cars lets you back in line because they have to. But while you're going along in line with everyone else, car after car after car after car does the exact same thing you just did. You spend more time hitting the brakes to let people back in line, so you almost feel like you're at a perpetual stoplight. I wanted to die, man. I pulled over and made my ex finish the California stretch because I was about an inch away from road rage. I guess he can't drive 55. Story 16. The utility I worked for hired a new human resources manager. One of the first new rules she implemented to cut overtime was if you worked over one day, you came in late by the same amount the next day. Example, worked over 15 minutes on Monday, you came in at 8:15 Tuesday. No unpre-approved exceptions. New rule went into effect Monday morning. Wednesday, a tractor-trailer accident resulted in my whole department working over 6 hours. When the entire department came in at 3 p.m. the next day, yes, I know that's 7 hours, but lunch hour is noon, everyone was freaking out. The head honcho looked like he was ready to have a heart attack. The human resources manager was in his office getting a new a-hole. The new rule was rescinded that day. Human resources manager didn't last even a year. Story 17. In New Jersey, my high school banned cell phones one year. It was the early 2000s, so there weren't iPhones yet. They were just disruptive texting devices, and our principal hated them. They weren't allowed anywhere inside the building. You couldn't even keep them in your backpack or locker in case of emergency. About a week into his new rule, 2 planes crashed into the World Trade Center, where many of the students' parents commuted to work. Without their cell phones, every worried student had to nervously wait around for hours to use one of the 2 phones the school office had just to check if their parents were alive. Nor could those parents reach their children in that time of crisis. The cell phone ban was lifted the next day. Our principal was still kind of angry about it, so he banned them again at the beginning of that next year. On the exact same day, 1 year later, an old rotting tree in front of the school decided to break apart and fall on top of a group of students, injuring a handful and killing one. This time the panic was reversed as parents were flooding the school's phone line, unable to reach their own children directly, trying to find out if the kids were hurt. The news had reported the story live before our school made any calls to any parents, and they didn't report any names, so of course, there was a mess and a huge panic. That ban was lifted again that next day. He didn't tempt fate again after that. I know you can absolutely make the argument that the phones are disruptive and people go, well, we didn't have them in my day, we got along just fine. But the truth of the matter is that parents and children alike, I mean, we're so accustomed to having this instant line of communication and be able to contact our family and our kids on a dime, and to sever that in any way just it causes so much panic because it's not normal in today's society. At least where I'm at. We don't take phones away from kids anymore in school because it's, hey, if Justin's mom needs to contact her kid and you're removing that line of communication, there's going to be hell to pay. You know, it's just kind of the world we live in. Granted, this whole story was back in 2001, but I am curious what the general consensus is now about whether or not the school should be able to take your phone from you. I was I was homeschooled for most of my life, so it didn't really apply. Moving on, story 18. punishing me for not taking my lunch. This was in Utah, one of the states out there that doesn't even require you to give your employees lunch, so this makes it even more absurd. The problem was they didn't want to cross-train others who were there to cover my role of loading up trucks with gasoline product. So I was busy as heck, no stop with no backup, and often didn't even have time to stop for lunch, or I'd get put back to work about 20 minutes into lunch. All of a sudden one day, because they were looking at causes of overtime and how to cut down on OT spend, I find my time card for the pay period has been cut back to reflect all these hour lunches I never got. I raised big heck about this, pointed out it was illegal. They tell me there is no reason I can't take an hour lunch every day. They regretted it when I'd lock myself up in my little outside shack for an hour and refuse to open it or come out regardless of what truck showed up if I was already on lunch. And once that became a big issue, I simply just left and stayed gone for an hour and refused to answer my phone. About several months into getting sick of ignoring my phone for a whole hour, I found it to be a great source of amusement answering it and telling them, sure, hang tight, I'm heading back into work right now. And then I would proceed to sit there and not bother returning to the property until an hour lunch was dang well over, while they all waited eagerly, thinking I was on my way back right now. Story 19. In college, I worked at a department store. I was a pretty good employee, I'd say. I always showed up on time, never called off. I always did the right thing. I folded and cleaned while others just loaded around, disappeared, or goofed off. I didn't ask for crazy accommodations with my schedule, so some sort of formal rolls around. I request off that Saturday and Sunday. Saturday was to attend, Sunday was to recover. I was informed that there was a new policy, and sales associates could no longer request off 2 days in a row. I was not guaranteed either. They would not give me a decision. I just had to wait till the schedule came out. I got the schedule. I was on till 4 on Saturday and open to close on Sunday. I worked that Saturday till 4, but wasn't happy about it and decided that they needed me more than I needed them. So if I woke up feeling good enough to go into work on Sunday, I would. If I didn't, well, I wouldn't. I didn't feel good Sunday morning, so I stayed in bed. I got a call from the manager shortly before shift. The manager wanted to know where I was and when I would be there. Then she emotionally unloaded on me. Then I told her she could enjoy covering for me for the rest of the week because not only was I not coming in for this shift that I had requested not to work, but I would also not be coming in for my remaining shifts ever. Story 20. I was in high school in the 1990s and early 2000s, and short shorts were fairly popular at the time for girls. It seemed like an arms race to see who could wear them the shortest without getting in trouble. When I started, the rule was vague and hard to define. Basically, it must be longer than a cheerleader skirt, but A, those were really short, and B, how do you compare that accurately to what someone else has on? So some genius thought, fingertip length. When standing up, the shorts must be at least as long as your middle finger as you held your hands by your side. A little side note, early on in high school, one of the teachers got a little too handsy with a student and got in massive trouble. His hand was on her lower back while talking to her despite her trying to get away. After this, teachers refrained from touching any students unless it was a hug the student initiated. So girls would get called out, hold their hands at their sides, but they learned that if they didn't have their arms firmly against their body and not quite straight, they could easily have their hands an inch or more higher on their legs, and since teachers didn't want to touch the girls, they couldn't ensure arms were straight. Also, some people just have short arms, and no matter what, they could wear some really short shorts or skirts as a result. For a few years, shorts and skirts actually got shorter than they were before the rule was implemented. By junior year, they settled on shorts and skirts must be at least 5 inches from the middle of the kneecap. Of course, this wasn't fair because 5 inches on a 5-foot flat girl looked really different than 5 inches on a 6-foot tall girl. But at least the staff could claim they were using the same metric across the board. I visited a teacher after school hours when I was in college because I had a physics question, and I'll just say it appears they had given up entirely because the shorts I saw then were far shorter than anything that existed when I went to school there. Story 21. Sweden's government decided that it's sexist for snowplows to target areas supposedly frequented more by men, like main roads, and said they should instead prioritize entrances to daycares, footpaths, and cycle paths, which they said are more used for women. If you were guessing this wouldn't go well, you would be absolutely correct. Public transport failed, traffic piled up, and injuries requiring a hospital visit spiked. The MP who suggested this defended his decision by saying the gender-equal plowing plan was implemented incorrectly. Personally, I wonder how this was supposed to help women at all. I think men and women basically use the same paths and roads. especially in a country that is as focused on gender equality as Sweden is. Men take their children to school as well. Also, it's really strange to assume that the reason snowplows prioritize main roads is because of sexism, and not just that more people use them. It seems a bit to me like they didn't care that their prioritization of women would leave more people worse off. Story 22. Not really a rule, but more of a bureaucratic mistake, but a good story nonetheless. So as a bit of a background, in Dutch high schools, you have school exams, SEs, which the school can produce freely, and a central exam, CE, which is a national test. The combined grades of a subject CE and SE will give you a final grade, which shows if you passed high school for that grade or not. So, SEs are basically super important tests because they will partly determine if you pass high school or not. At the beginning of the school year, you get a summary of every SE you will have that year, including the things you need to learn to make them, chapters and textbooks, etc., and any tools you get to do them with, calculators and such. So my grade had an English SE, and we were all studying vocabulary lists, as was required. But one day, a week or two before the SE, a girl in our grade noticed that in the summary, the tools and study materials for the SE were switched up by mistake. It said that you needed to study with no tools, and tools at your disposal were vocabulary lists A through F. She announced it to the faculty, only a short time before the SE, but because the SE and everything surrounding it couldn't be changed because of regulations, the students could just make their tests with vocabulary sheets. Needless to say, everyone passed the SE. Story 23. My high school went crazy a couple of years ago with its rules, because the principal had a genuine dictatorship problem. First, a no-touch rule was implemented, which I guess is fair enough to stop kids from either fighting or showing gross PDA, but it also involved kids getting detention for hugging each other when they saw each other after summer. Then the girls got a uniform change, Catholic school, strict uniform. He tried to make it so every girl had to tie their hair up every day. During sports class and science, we could totally understand because of the health and safety, but 24/7 hair tied up was an effing joke. Around the same time, principal made a rule saying that kids couldn't hang around in groups larger than 4 at break. And that's when everything backfired. Literally 5 kids standing chatting would be broken up because apparently it promoted gang culture. These kids just wanted to talk to their friends. Needless to say, pretty much every parent came in with huge complaints. Newspapers were reporting on it. People who didn't even go to the school but lived in the area were up in arms. And those last 2 rules were very quickly changed in under a week. Story 24. I used to work at a fast food place where the owner made employee meals discounted 10% instead of how they were at all other stores in the area. Free. There was one store about an hour away that wasn't free, but their employee meal was discounted 50%. When I started working there, I was not willing to pay for the food, so I would just make it, eat it, and not ring it up. Everyone started doing it. Eventually, the owner assumed that was happening, so he said anyone who works has to leave a receipt in the register at the end of the shift with their employee discount on it to prove that they paid. He literally thought he could force us to eat every shift. Easy fix. Every shift, I would give some random person my employee discount and I'd still eat for free. Once again, everyone else started doing this. Owner was later fired when the franchise found out that he wasn't using certain food that he was supposed to. He'd buy it cheaper from the local grocers. I guess there was an anonymous tip to corporate. Shortly after I quit on some very bad terms. Story 25. The Free Roaming Wild Horse and Burros Act. Congress implemented this federal law as a means to protect the wild horse population because wild horses represent the free spirit of the West. As it turns out, horses are exotic to our current ecosystem. Horses existed here 13,000 years ago, but were wiped out, and the North American ecosystems have changed to make do without them. They weren't reintroduced until the Spanish expeditions in the 1600s, where a few horses managed to escape captivity. They are also highly invasive. They damage every ecosystem they're a part of and utterly kill biodiversity. They also reproduce at a rate of 20% annually, which is huge for a species whose mares can only produce 1 offspring per breeding season. This high rate of reproduction is mainly due to the lack of natural predation. I mean, within 6 years of passing the Free Roaming Wild Horse and Burros Act, horse populations tripled and they continued to grow. Since they're protected, we can't really do anything with them. We can't kill them and we can't sell them to be killed, so to control the population, BLM basically rounds up the excess and ships them to facilities where they are cared for until they die. This process costs us millions every year. BLM's budget for 2018 set aside $70 million just for horses, and that doesn't include the cost of these horse care facilities. On a side note, it's kind of funny actually, because President Trump proposed that we sell these horses to countries that would be able to eat them or use them in some way, since we can't, as a means of cutting back on costs associated with horse care and even subsidize our capture efforts a bit. Well, of course, the headlines then read, "Trump wants to mass slaughter the wild horses," or something along those lines, which naturally drives public opinion against the idea, even though it seems like a fairly common sense thing to do. To be fair, in order for that proposal to be legal, we'd have to abolish this act, which I'm perfectly okay with.
A lot of people said we're killing horses, have we? No, we haven't.
Story 26. In 8th grade, we had a computer class with a teacher who was pretty rude. My friend and I did not take well to his demeanor, and he was a new teacher as well. It wasn't long after our first week of school we figured out he was a real jerk. My friend is a homosexual, and this teacher would give him a hard time, so guess what? We gave this MFer a year to remember. From taping the laser under his computer mouse before class so he'd spend 10 minutes looking to make sure the connection was right, to spit wads, to making drawings and jokes about him, because that's 8th grade to us, and that's what we wanted to do in retaliation, baby. One day he decided to revoke our internet privileges on our specified computers, and we were in charge of the school webpage. Then he'd lower our grades since we weren't allowed access to our schoolwork. What did this do? Give us more time to think of revenge plots. This included putting on our clunky school earphones with them not connected so he'd scream at us, "No music!" Then we'd hold up the unconnected end of the plug and just smile. He eventually got so fed up with us he'd send us out to the hall every single day during class so he wouldn't have to deal with us. But he sent us out in chairs that have wheels. So every day from that point on, instead of having computer class, we had a race down the hallway in rolling chairs class. It was hilarious. By this point, multiple kids were purposely getting sent out of class every day to join the rolly chair races. It was a year full of wins, losses, and mostly triumph. The teacher didn't even give enough crap to stop us. He would literally watch us flying and spinning down the hallways at top speed through his classroom window. He would just shake his head, probably pondering his own existence at this point, hoping maybe one or all of us would fall to our own demise. Every single rule this teacher implemented completely backfired. Needless to say, he wasn't a teacher for a very long. Story 27. For the 2010 census, I worked an information table to help people who were traditionally undercounted to navigate the forms, how to fill them out properly in various languages, and answer the questions. We were assigned negotiated locations beforehand, and there was no changing placement. Mine was at the YWCA, Women's Shelter for At-Risk Women and their children, domestic abuse, and so forth. The rule was to sit in office, specially set up for census takers between the hours of 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. to help any walk-ins. However, shelter rules were that no one was allowed during those hours, to avoid hanging out when they could be looking for alternate housing or jobs, etc. The doors to the building were locked during those hours and no one was allowed in. So, it was me and a single staffer in the building the entire time. There was literally no one to assist with their census forms. It was a 2-week gig and I never saw a single soul. I was finishing college at the time, so I got in a lot of studying. Story 30. My summer camp had a no-phone policy a while back for a few weeks. The division leaders took phones and kept them for a few hours and made the parents come in after, and when parents couldn't make it because of work, they stopped that. Then they started to just take then and then give them at the end of the day, and then when one kid missed like 4 calls from his dad, they stopped doing that too. Halfway through the summer, they just held them until they finished talking, which resulted in more parental hate, and when all that backfired too, they just started to give speeches. One of the DLs was very annoyed by the constant phones and was fed up with all of the parents, so he started to threaten to throw the phones into the lake. It all stopped when he threw a kid's phone into the lake, but he actually let it go either by accident or as a jerk move. We still don't know. From there, he was fired, and with a few more very angry parents voicing their frustration at the camp, suddenly no one cared what the kids were doing. Story 32. Several years back, I managed a group of 6 people, 2 of whom were women. Coincidentally, they both ended up pregnant at the same time. When the day comes and they both leave on 20 weeks of maternity leave, I find out that not only do I have to hold their jobs for them, but I can't have any temporary replacements because as far as the company was concerned, I was fully staffed. We were just expected to suck the work up of 1/3 of the team that was no longer doing it. When annual review time came around, I was told by my team that was underperforming. The fact that we were understaffed by 1/3 was understood, but the review system didn't allow that to be taken into consideration. So we all got effed on raises and bonuses. The best part is I found out that women on the maternity leave automatically get 5 out of 5 performance reviews because it wouldn't be fair to rate them while they're on leave. So the women not working got significantly better bonuses than all of the men who were doing their work for them. At the end of the 2 girls' leave, one just said, "I'm not coming back." She just wanted to stretch out her benefits coverage as long as possible. The other one did come back to work and announced that she was already pregnant again, which I didn't even think was possible. So a few months later, we were saying goodbye to her again for another 20 weeks. The guys who had to pick up the slack very much resented the whole situation, and 2 quit for other jobs over it. At one point, the team was down to 2 people, the rest having quit or on leave. Story 33. One of my previous jobs, a coworker told me a story about how he trusted the wrong fart when he was on a way out in the sticks and about 100 miles from his house delivering office products. There was no drivers in the area to relieve him, so he stopped at a gas station bathroom and tried to clean up as best as he could. His boxers were a total loss, of course, but he had still gotten enough on his pants for the smell to be obvious within conversational range. But he still had a full van route to run. So instead of entering the customer business, saying hi, and getting a signature, he decided to just slide the product as far into the lobby as he could from the front door, say, "Hey, how y'all doing? Y'all have a good one," and then signed the proof of delivery as left at door for 35 different customers. So, of course, a few of those customers called in on him asking what the heck was going on. Some of those calls made it to the owner of the business, so the owner called the driver and asked the driver to explain himself, which the driver did in full. He asked the driver if he had called in the issue to dispatch, and the driver had, adding that dispatch had signed off on his plan. So after he got off the call with the driver, he walked to the dispatch office and asked the dispatcher if the driver had called in his dilemma. The dispatcher confirmed that the driver had indeed called it in and that they had authorized him to leave the orders at the customer's doors. Naturally, this made the owner mad, at which point he yelled, red-faced, "New rule, if a driver craps his own pants, he goes home. I don't care where he is or what's left on his trousers or his route, we can't have drivers going around smelling like crap. It's bad for business." Fast forward 3 months. Our shipper's trucks are late. I'd just gotten back from a very early route. I had to help put out fires all over the warehouse due to the late trucks, and then get drivers loaded and out the door before I had to load up and run a second route of my own because another driver had called out that morning. It was shaping up to be a horrible day at an already horrible job, and I wanted no part of it. So instead of running around like an underpaid chicken with my head cut off, I simply recalled what my coworker told me about rule number 1 regarding number 2, and crapped my pants in front of the dispatcher. He had to send me home because it was in the rules and I got a free day off. Please let this be a real story. Story 34. I was a police officer, and my agency's administration, even fearful of lawsuits, implemented a policy that we shall not initiate vehicle pursuits when the only violation is a traffic infraction. The policy was, in fact, so narrowly worded that you could only initiate a vehicle pursuit if the driver, or other occupant, of the vehicle was wanted for a violent felony, like murder or kidnapping, etc. This went on for several months. We let stolen cars go with regular frequency, not a violent felony. The bad guys in town got wind of the new policy and just wouldn't stop anymore. One day, an officer tried to make a traffic stop on a vehicle for some type of moving violation, speeding, etc. The vehicle failed to yield and the officer, compliant with policy, let the vehicle go. The driver had just unalived his wife and his wife's brother. He subsequently killed another individual approximately an hour after the officer discontinued and let him go. They reverted back to the old discretionary policy pretty quickly after that. Story 35. My favorite example I give in business as to why we don't always have strict corporate rules and utilize discernment in handling situations is this. Disney companies have a policy that you can't just fire or let go a person for bad performance. They need to be reviewed, discussed with, and presented steps or a plan in some manner to bring them up to satisfactory performance. They get a year to improve themselves. At the heart of this policy is something good. It's about building up your team to be their best and cultivating employees you want to stick around and be lifers. The reason it fails, though, is that if the person does anything, absolutely anything to improve themselves in a year, then they can't be let go. Just trying to succeed without any actual success at all shows desire to improve, so they keep their job. The end result is that people just get transferred around to get them off projects and out of your hair. So there's a subset of employees that just get cycled up and down around forever because they are basically worthless. Story 36. My work implemented a policy this year that part-timers would be scheduled all the closing shifts, while the full-timers were given the opening shifts. Our company also has an attendance credit system, where you lose credits if you call out and gain credits for working your scheduled shifts, and there was no cap on attendance credits. Well, at our store, most of our part-timers are older people who have been in the same store with the same position for years, decades even. So they have a ton of attendance credits, like triple digits worth. During the holiday season, we stay open pretty late, past midnight sometimes. Try getting a 75-year-old grandmother to work until midnight or later. They just call out for every shift, leaving us screwed at night, but there's nothing to do as they have all the credits to do it. Story 37. Senior year, my school gave everyone laptops and made us all sign acceptable use agreements, stating that we could not use VPNs. Well, of course, we all downloaded them onto Chrome immediately. It took the district close to a whole year to realize we were doing it, and they decided to block VPN attachments. The block would only prevent Chrome from working until you got the VPN taken off. That would require an admin, and then they would fix your computer and then give you a referral. Of course, no one turned in their computers, so the geniuses at the district decided to have a mandatory 2-question survey that was required to graduate. They downloaded files onto everyone's Z drive, and the file would open the question into Chrome. You couldn't take the survey if you had a VPN, but the idiots didn't realize that Chrome is a web browser and it had a URL. Me and my friend copied and pasted it onto Firefox and bingo, and hey, survey complete, baby. Immediately texted our school-wide GroupMe and everyone got off scot-free. Story 38. This isn't a famous example, rather something from my own personal experience. I work in a preschool, and at lunchtime we try to implement a rule where the children don't eat their dessert first. Seems reasonable, right? Except every day we spend it debating with 3 to 5-year-olds exactly what is a dessert. Since we don't have hot lunch, it's not universal what the kids should be eating for lunch. Sometimes kids come with a sandwich and a chocolate. Other kids come with pasta and fruit. Other kids come with just pretzels, chips, and a yogurt. And every day the kids police each other on eating dessert first. So we hear stuff like, Jane is eating her dessert first, except her dessert in this case is yogurt because she had a sandwich and veggies for her main lunch. But for someone else, their main food is the yogurt. The other day I actually argued with a preschooler that his pasta was not dessert, even though it was sweet. He was only eating pretzels and hummus and refused to eat his pasta because it was too sweet, therefore it was his dessert. Basically, we've given up because it's just turned into a disaster where every day I have kids asking me can they eat their food or can't they because it's all dessert, or it's just arguing with preschoolers about what is healthy anyways. Story 39. A large group of women and religious zealots started the temperance movement, hoping it would make better men out of our fellow male Americans. Alcohol abuse became a big problem of the late 19th and nascent 20th centuries, so it wasn't like this movement was tiny. It involved the Methodists, the Baptists, Mormons, the temperance movement, the women's suffrage movement, and all of the other fun-loving groups who pop up every 30 months or so to rob us of yet another fun way to have fun. In the upswell of passing the Universal Suffrage Amendment 19, a second amendment became law as well, 18. The 18th Amendment passed swiftly, and no one pondered the ramifications. Women thought they had won both suffrage and a less drunk society. Men thought they had just made a big step forward in a more sober and happy world. Within 2 years, mobsters in Chicago and the New York City had set up an illicit and complex alcohol manufacturing and distribution network. You would have never heard of the name Al Capone if it had not been for the 18th Amendment. Speakeasies rose up across the country, and in most small towns the prohibition laws were ignored. Moonshine and homemade beer were plentiful everywhere, but in the big cities, and even in the big cities, beer was like weed today. You could obtain it, but it would cost you. Speaking of weed, it is these same groups along with William Randolph Hearst who had banned marijuana just a decade earlier. They love having fun, don't they? Anyways, after 10 years of a massive crime wave sweeping the country, followed by a massive economic downturn, FDR campaigned on repealing prohibition and he won in a landslide. The 21st Amendment repeals prohibition. However, due to a long period of beer and liquor being off the market, Americans' taste had changed. Homemade beer was watered down to spread it out to more people over a longer period of time. Same for liquor. so beer that was made afterwards was less strong and less flavorful. If you ever want to blame anyone for the sorry taste of American beer such as Bud Light, look no further than the temperance movement and their menagerie of fun-loving, church-going compatriots. Story 40. My high school has a carpool system, and it's hard to explain over text, but imagine a square campus with the high school in the left, elementary school in the middle, and the middle school on the right. Kids in high school would come in from the top and do kind of a U-turn near the end of one side, then leave the way they came in, while the middle school and elementary school would enter the right side, drop off their kids, then cut through the middle of campus and exit out of the top. It worked well and there were no problems, but the school decided to spend about $1 million to have these safety experts come in and find what needed to be fixed. And then they came to the conclusion that the carpool is what needed to be changed. All this build up to say that their new carpool system they implemented had everyone from every school entering in one entrance. And when you drive from the high school section to the middle or elementary school section, it goes from 2 lanes to 1. So the first day they implemented it, kids from every school ended up being 30 minutes late because the lines were chaotic and so inflated because there was a huge bottleneck that was 3 times the amount of people that were trying to get through. Our principal announced at 11 a.m. and basically said, "Yep, that didn't work. Back to the old way tomorrow." Story 41. Massachusetts State Assembly pushed a law stripping the governor of the power to appoint a U.S. senator, which later caused the Democrats in the U.S. Senate to lose the supermajority in the early 2010s, thus changing the political landscape and how ACA, Obamacare, was formed. In 2004, then Senator John Kerry had the potential to be the president, which meant that his seat could have been vacant. With Governor Mitt Romney, that would have meant he could appoint a senator to fill the seat for the remainder of the term. Most likely, he would have chosen a fellow Republican to fill the vacancy. The Senate Assembly then chose to change the law, stripping the governor for the power to choose a senator and leaving it in the hands of the people through a special election. The presidential election resulted in John Kerry losing to George W. Bush, and that was the end of it. Or so we thought. In August 2009, Senator Ted Kennedy died of glioblastoma, a type of brain cancer, leaving his Senate seat vacant. Since there are new laws regarding how senators are appointed, MA had to follow through with having a special election to appoint a new senator. At that time, ACA, aka Obamacare, was being formed and pushed through the House and held the supermajority at exactly 60 votes by the Democrats. Without it, the Republicans can filibuster a bill to death. The state assembly passed a law allowing the new governor, Deval Patrick, to appoint an interim senator until special elections have concluded. He chose a Democrat, Paul Kirk. This meant that the Senate had until the end of the year to pass the Affordable Care Act. They had to rush it, pushing through a draft that could have been better in December. In 2010, the special elections were conducted in January, and Scott Brown, Republican, had an upset win, thus ending the supermajority that the Democrats in Senate enjoyed. At time, any living and breathing Democrat was basically expected to win the Senate seat. Attorney General of Massachusetts, Martha Coakley, won the primaries and decided to sit on her win. Meanwhile, Scott Brown worked furiously to earn his votes and started to climb the polls while his opponent wasn't anywhere near as much to be seen campaigning. At one point, Coakley answered a question, what she should be doing to combat her sliding popularity in the contest, with a rhetorical question. As opposed to standing outside Fenway Park, in the cold, shaking hands with voters, this referenced the actions of Scott Brown. On top of that, she called Kurt, Bloody Sock, shilling a Yankee fan. That was a big no-no. In the end, she lost. Scott Brown won, thus ending the supermajority that the Democrats enjoyed in the Senate. Story 42. Our middle school had a math teacher who was constantly struggling to keep kids engaged. One day she called on one of the class troublemakers to answer something, and he blatantly had not been paying attention. When he couldn't even comment on the subject matter, she asked him why, to which he responded something along the lines of, "Your class sucks and I don't want to be here." Small yelling match ensued, to which she ended the battle with, "If you don't want to be here, then get out of my classroom." He laughed it off and left promptly. She was crazy heated at this point and proceeded to yell, "And if anyone else thinks math is unimportant, waste of time, you should leave now too." A few more kids got up and randomly walked out, which led to the entire class following. The teacher sat there and cried. Being middle schoolers, the entire class opted to roam the halls in a group of 30 to 40 students and taunt the other kids that hadn't been given a get-out-of-jail-free card by doing dumb kid things like pelvic thrusting or mooning others through the tiny windows on the classroom doors. We got to roam around the halls high-fiving and spitballing for almost 20 minutes before the principal was able to pinpoint the horde's location and put a stop to the shenanigans. Story 43. Many years ago, I worked for a gaming company that was an offshoot from an SW development company. They There were a lot of differences between these two wings, including age. We were a young lot, 20s, and the others were in their 30s. While they had a lot of experience dealing with correctness and maintainability of software, we were more concerned with prove and disprove of an idea, the coolness and fun factor. Some genius manager somewhere decided that the gaming group had to learn from the other group without taking into account the fact that we throw away 90% of what we create because most of it was not fun. Some changes that happened overnight. 1. Massive test case repo. Since automation was not happening in the graphics driver, we had to do manual tests for non-unit tests. 2. Blocking non-relevant websites like /dot.org and gamesultra.com because it sounded too similar to relationship yoga. 3. Code reviews by the software group. Imagine writing shader code in assembly and having it reviewed by Java programmers. 4. Visual source safe for source code control and content control. There was Scrum thrown around, though I didn't know what they were on about. They gave up pretty quickly on this. To be fair, there were other things they implemented, like some design patterns, code branching strategies, that greatly helped me, personally, but we'll not talk about the broken clock also being right twice a day. This led to 1. A slowed pace of output. It is an idea that needs to be proven. I have to write these test cases only to have the code thrown out because of the fun factor. This taught me to deduce, now you have 2 products to maintain, your product and the test cases. Better be worth the cost. Now I use the sophisticated phrase, cost of quality. 2. My interest in SSH and SSH proxies and DNS mirroring, along with discovering things like etc and hosts, all courtesy of the articles I had read on. You guessed it, /dot.org. 3. How to do checkbox-oriented code reviews and miss the intent of code reviews. Java programmers loving their life when comparing their beans to DirectX and com versus decom and Win32. Also them pitying us C++ programmers for memory leaks. 4. Art assets. Binary in nature, randomly getting corrupted. VSS was fine for code, but for binaries? Come on. Needless to say, this left a bad taste in our mouth about anything they brought to us. Took me a couple of good mentors to unlearn and relearn better practices. In my opinion, knowledge is what hurt us. There was no one wise enough to start with the problem and then think about the solutions. Story 44. My boss didn't like that I would go out regularly for a few puffs of a cig. It was a family-owned business and I ran it for him. He was still working with us, but I was the hiring and firing guy and the manager and could pay employees with the company credit card that they gave me. It goes to say that I have a lot of responsibility within the business. He came to me one day and said I take too much free time and I need to clock out whenever I leave my desk. I was going out about once an hour for literally under 2 minutes and never took my 15-minute breaks. The next 2 weeks, I clocked every employee in and out every time they stepped away from their desk for non-work related things. This included the owner and his wife, who both worked with us and didn't make salary, so they could skimp on taxes and give themselves overtime each paycheck. I'm happy to say that was not an issue for very long and ended very quickly. I made my point that I'm not a time thief and I'm a dang good worker. To be fair, I was taking more time than my lunch and 2 15-minute breaks allowed, but out of the 8 employees, I was third to last on the list of abused time management. The owner's wife and the 2 sales girls were the worst, followed by the designer, the owner, and then myself. Story 45. I used to work at a large chain supermarket with something like 500 staff. It was more like a knock on the effect of selfishness and cheapness and rule-making frenzies that caused issues. So first we had this rule that if you brought something to eat for your lunch from the store, you had to keep the receipt and get a supervisor staff member to sign it to say they witnessed you purchase it. This was to prevent people stealing food, although I'm not sure if this had ever actually been a problem or if the rule even helped. The whole process took half your break sometimes, since the supervisors were always busy and didn't even have a pen half of the time. So people would just buy their lunch and get whoever checked them out to promise to back them up if they got called out. Then we got a new supervisor from another store. She decided that this would now be strictly enforced with security guards at the foot of the stairs up to the staff areas, searching everyone's bags. This led to queues for everybody entering or exiting the staff area. It meant that a lot of people got penalized for being late to clock into their shift, back from break, etc., and that anyone who did follow the rules and get their receipt signed would not have enough time to eat whatever they just bought. Security were even sanctioned to randomly search lockers for possible stolen food or goods. They had to pull you off the shop floor for this too, and some supervisors even tried to get the affected members of the staff to clock out for the process, which turned out to be pretty illegal, so it turned into a whole thing. Some people started getting very upset by this naturally and did one of two things. One, they went to the McDonald's opposite the store on their break. They often had to queue and there was no discount, but at least they'd get to eat. Management didn't like people leaving the store though, since it made things difficult in case of fire. Plus, there was now burger wrappers and stuff clogging up all the bins. So they banned people from being able to leave the store on their breaks. This led to parking tickets because people couldn't move their cars. Max 4-hour stay with no special provisions for staff. It also led back to the stairs queue and people to get disciplinary actions taken against them if they left to go to their bank or take a phone call outside or whatever. 2, people brought their own lunches. This led to even worse problems. Most people who worked there also did their grocery shopping there due to the 10% discount. Even if they didn't, the security guards searching bags didn't have any proof that people weren't just buying and stealing food from the store then throwing them in a lunchbox. So people either started doing exactly that and just taking an empty lunchbox to work with them to fill, or they would start bringing their grocery receipts with them to work. Security were forced to go through the receipts and check off the items on them, so hey, more queues. Previously, the only people bringing a packed lunch had been the HR and management, so there was only a single large fridge in the break area. Now all the checkout and floor staff were bringing packed lunches, there wasn't enough room for everyone. Since management and HR typically worked 9 to 5 and floor staff could start work any time as early as 5:30 a.m., this led to outrage, since management and HR felt they should have exclusive access to the limited space in the fridge. So rather than buy additional fridges, they moved the fridge into the HR office, which was locked until 9 a.m. when they started, and which regular staff weren't allowed to enter without a valid reason. This upset people even further. Naturally, but worse than that, since this all began in the summer months, people that brought a packed lunch started getting sick. Turns out that storing yogurts, meat sandwiches, etc. in an unconditioned locker room under everyone's coats and bags right by the radiator? Yeah, people were calling in with sick food poisoning, diarrhea, etc., all of it, which led to more absences from food poisoning and diarrhea meant that management decided to crack down on calling in sick. The new rules were that all sickness absence had to be accompanied by a doctor's note, no matter what. Since food poisoning tends to last only a day, and NHS wait times are more like 2 weeks for a doctor's appointment, people were getting disciplinary hearings for not bringing notes. Additionally, there was a 3-strike policy on calling in sick. Basically, if you called in once and took a week, it was the same as calling in for a day. So even though there was no sick pay, a lot of people took multiple days or even multiple weeks off, since they would get the same punishment anyway. And a lot of staff were college students who just didn't care that much. So they were ending up with less instances of calling in sick, but higher rates of absences overall. So then management decided that supervisors were now going to be sent on home visits to repeat offenders to ensure that they were actually sick. Luckily, this only got as far as day 1. One of the first people visited happened to be in the union, which most of us hadn't joined due to the cost. Sick from dialysis treatments and absolutely furious, she called in her union rep and recounted everything that had been happening, along with a bunch of other stuff I haven't even mentioned. The union came in and boy did they have some crap to do. A ton of management got moved around and sacked, thousands were spent on new break room stuff including fridges and vending machines, most of the previous rules overturned, etc. Even the store manager got replaced. The 3 strikes rule remained, but home visits were no longer allowed and no doctor's notes were required for calling in sick for less than 3 days. There was an exception with diarrhea, since we worked with food, where you would have to get a doctor's note regardless, so most people would just lie about what their illness was. Basically, to sum it all up, one power-hungry supervisor that decided to start over-enforcing a rule nobody even cared about in the first place caused a huge conflict. Story 46. Community college school that's mostly a commuter's school as the houses near the college are expensive AF. I mean like multi-millionaire status, most of which are not available for students to dorm in. So kids from all over the state have to commute to this school from very far away. Most of these kids, being that they're poor and taking out financial aid and loans, can't even afford cars. They take public transportation. Now, tardiness was treated as half of an absence. 2 absences would mean you failed the course. This kind of school policy felt a little stupid because beforehand this college wasn't all that competitive. It felt like a literal policy to make poor students' lives harder and make them fail easier. Particularly, that would mean mostly Latin American students and black students coming from poorer neighborhoods. Whenever I had that loud, slightly ignorant black girl in my lab group, I would go the extra mile to help her learn the material because 1, a lot of these girls had kids, and 2, they had disadvantaged schooling, and 3, the school policies literally set itself up to fail these kinds of students. Now, the department head who made those standards all got fired. There's no penalty for being late anymore. If the teacher does feel a grudge, it's more so that they lost their train of thought during lecture rather than them wanting to penalize you, and that affects the whole class. But if someone can come into class without distracting anyone, why is it even a problem? There is no penalty for absence except more than 2 absences, and you lose a letter grade each time. If you have a legitimate excuse and communicate with the professor, your absences don't count whatsoever. It didn't used to be this lenient. It was horrendous back then, as they wouldn't even accept a gosh dang doctor's note. I remember in statistics course, I got strep throat and gave a doctor's note to the dean saying I'll be out for like a week or 2. My professor failed me and I had to appeal to the dean, and this process took literally 2 years to figure out, which at the time the statistics course put me on academic probation. That was a long time ago, like 10 years ago. Ironically, they have way more lenient attendance policy now, and I'm never absent or late to anywhere anymore. Story 47. Not sure it's a massive backfire, but Seattle just passed a sugary drink tax not long ago that's now in effect, and there are several problems with it. 1, it's a sales-based tax, which is inherently regressive. It has a greater impact on the poor, who are already more likely to consume cheap foods and drinks with a little nutritional value. 2, Seattle is routinely ranked among the healthiest cities in the country, so it's not like we have a high rate of obesity or weight-related health problems that needs to be curbed. 3, you can just drive outside the city to get your sugary drinks without paying the added tax. I actually go to the Costco outside Seattle now for my Red Bull needs. The employees at the Costco told me they've seen a significant bump in business since Seattle passed the tax. 4, we just voted on and passed a statewide initiative that places a ban on other cities implementing their own sugar taxes. So now the disparity pointed out in number 3 is basically codified into law. As an armchair lawyer, this initiative seems to conflict with our state constitution's requirement that allows cities to tax their citizens however they see fit. It's just a misguided and backwards way of addressing the obesity crisis and all the health problems that come with it. Really? We need a state income tax to replace all of our regressive sales taxes, but it's political self-unaliving around here for anyone who even proposes or talks about that. Edit. Thought of another example that's Seattle-specific and a bit more massive in the impact it's had. I can't speak for other states that have legalized marijuana, but here in Washington, and specifically Seattle, legalizing it has removed one problem: incarceration for possession of marijuana, and exacerbated another: higher rates of hard drug usage. Back when we legalized, my wife was working for a nonprofit dedicated to youth homelessness. This is totally anecdotal as I don't have any charts or stats to back this up, but she said that she and her staff saw a significant shift in the drugs these kids started using, moving away from heroin to much, much harder drugs. Street prices for weed went up to better match but still undercut the taxed retail prices, so the better cost value purchase for getting high became the harder drugs. I'd be curious if other cities have seen the same trend. Story 48. The Cobra Effect. The British government was concerned about the number of venomous cobra snakes in Delhi, India. The government therefore offered bounty for every dead cobra. Initially, this was a successful strategy, as a large number of snakes were killed for the reward. Eventually, however, enterprising people began to breed cobras for the income. When the government became aware of this, the reward program was scrapped, causing the cobra breeders to set the now worthless snakes free. As a result, the wild cobra population further increased. The apparent solution for the problem made the situation even worse: the rat effect. A similar incident occurred in Vietnam under the French colonial rule. The colonial regime created a bounty program that paid a reward for each rat killed. To obtain the bounty, people would provide the severed rat tail. Colonial officials, however, began noticing rats with no tails. The Vietnamese rat catchers would capture rats, lop off their tails, and then just release them back into the sewers so that they could procreate and produce more rats, thereby increasing the rat catchers' revenue. Story 49. My high school banned backpacks in classrooms. The reasoning was that it was a fire hazard. If we ever had to leave in a hurry, having a bunch of backpacks in the hall was no good. No exceptions. Problem was, this was a tiny backwoods high school with the narrowest hallways. and somehow was still too small for a town that graduates like 80 people a year? This meant gridlocked hallways and scattered lockers with only 7 minutes between classes. Everyone was consistently 10 minutes late, and we'd still get in trouble for it. My grade in particular made a game of it to see if we could burn an entire class period by forcing the teacher to write every single student up. Closest we got is 45 minutes of writing up students and like 10 minutes of class. We were rolling on the ground laughing. The teachers, however, were very upset. They just wanted to get through the lessons, but the administration, most of who never taught anything in their lives, never budged an inch until we literally weren't learning anything anymore. Story 50. Banning the website Backpage. Posting this from memory, so please forgive any inaccuracies. There used to be a law in the US that did not hold websites liable for the content that they hosted. There have been limitations though, but websites like Backpage and even Craigslist were allowed to post advertisements for sex workers. A lot of people were against this, but the law was the law. A few extreme cases combined with public outrage were used to pressure politicians to get rid of the protections. Now, websites can be held liable for the content that they host. Backpage and Craigslist personnels disappear. As an added bonus, I think the creators of Backpage were charged as criminals as well. The unintended consequences of this ban is that it caused the killing rate to go up by a significant margin. What no lawmaker took into consideration was that intimate relation workers will exist regardless of it being illegal or not. With these websites, the workers were able to better vet their johns, share information about unsafe clients, free themselves from depending on dangerous pimps, etc. The ban brought prostitution back to the street corners, and the killing rate soared. Story 51. I'm a retail manager and managed a small corporate chain, mall stores with clothing, memorabilia, whatnot that I will not name. Just a few years back, the store was very oriented towards a certain subculture, and we hired people who looked and fit the image, leading to a lot of the employees being friends outside of work. Most of them were good friends, and none of them I would consider to be big partiers. But at one point, one of them found a section in the employee handbook stating, an employee of the legal age can have no more than 2 alcoholic beverages on break or within 4 hours of their shift starting time. We were in a big mall with multiple bars and restaurants, and one of the bars in the mall offered a birthday boot in the tradition of those German glass boots people drink out of. It was massive and kind of gimmicky, probably weighing in around a liter or so each. And although it was a birthday item, you could purchase one for like $15 or something. A few of my employees found this out and took it upon themselves to see if they could slam 2 on their breaks to add some spice to the second half of their shift. Soon, though, my entire staff was taking their breaks in sync and trying to drink each other under the table in a 35-minute time span. The restaurant was making bank on all the boots and started encouraging them and offering them incentives for buying multiple boots. Being a giant corporate retailer who's still in almost every mall, there was little I could do to change the company policy, and to this day, I'm pretty sure that it's still included in the employee handbook. Story 52. A call center I worked at as a temp for the holidays implemented a rule that you had to work 3, 6, or 9 hours in their assigned blocks. People either couldn't start as early as the block did or had to leave before the block ended. So the workers couldn't work enough hours, and the company had to hire more employees, more hassle to be able to cover all the hours. So let's say the block started at 8 a.m., but you couldn't come in till at least 9 a.m. With the blocks, you couldn't start until 11, you'd lose those 2 hours. But if you had to leave at 12, you couldn't work the 11 block either. So you didn't work that day and didn't make any money. This started because the year before, they allowed you to work as many hours as you wanted as long as it was at least 2 hours. And you could start on the hour or half hour, whatever. But the scheduling person complained about the chaos of keeping track of all the requested hours, and she suggested to simplify things, which just made it way worse. Story 53. I had a professor in college who was crazy strict on punctuality and would wait by the door with his phone and close it at exactly 10 a.m. If anyone tried to come in after the door was closed, he would ask them to explain why they were late, and he'd then try to make fun of them in front of everyone. And after they sat down and he had finished talking, this was a physics tutorial, so he'd talk for a bit, and then we'd try and solve problems for a bit. He'd go over to where they were sitting and give them a talk about why they needed to be more punctual and have more respect for him. Happened to me one time, and I instinctively went to check my watch because I didn't even realize I was late. Turns out I arrived 20 seconds after the hour. Luckily, he thought that was rather disrespectful, so I got an extra earful. We responded by just not showing up at all if we thought we were going to be even 1 second late. And the people who did show up just signed our initials on the sign-in sheet. After a few weeks, he must have realized people were voting with their feet because he stopped. Still stood by the door with his countdown timer and gave a grimace though. Story 54. In the old Catholic high school I used to go to, a lot of the parents complained that they should change the girls' uniforms from the dress to a skirt and shirt because the dresses were too thick and in summer you would die wearing them. They were petty about it and decided to change its entire uniform, color, and clothing. The problem was that to buy the new uniform, you had to go to a specific place. Most schools sell them in different places at different prices, don't ask me why, and it was effing expensive to purchase the whole thing. So a lot of kids came in with the old uniform, others with the new one but only a few pieces of it. After a few weeks, the school demanded that if you didn't come to school with the entire new uniform, you would be suspended and sent home. The whole thing backfired because kids still came in with the old uniform long after they said that, and those who didn't had their moms craft the new uniform by buying similar clothes and sewing the logo of the school on. My mom said to me that they sold the uniforms in that specific place to make more profit, which makes the fact that half the school had DIY uniforms even more hilarious. Story 55. I work EMS. I'm not going to get into the medical details, but a couple of years ago, there was a rule that no patient who had inserted a breathing tube for was allowed to be transported to the hospital without a waveform and a number value for the CO2 they would be breathing out. Unfortunately, this created a circumstance where if you had a problem with your equipment, mind you that this device only served to detect a problem with the breathing tube, it didn't actually make the person better, you could not move to the hospital. In fact, if you did, you would be restricted, which means you are barred from seeing patients until an investigation is conducted. This led to many people being restricted while others sat on scene with the sickest patients waiting for another ambulance to bring one of these devices. However, if the person didn't have a pulse and that they were being resuscitated, there was no rule against pronouncing them dead without this device giving you a value, only against taking them to the hospital. So, if you had a value and it was high, you could take them to the hospital and continue resuscitating them. If you didn't, they're probably too far gone, just pronounce them dead. So messed up. Story 56. After the communist revolution in China, the party had to find a way to modernize the economy and feed the very rural population. This caused two problems. Firstly, the party encouraged farmers to smelt all the iron they could in backyard furnaces to make materials for construction. However, the iron they produced was virtually unusable because they made most of it out of household cooking utensils and farming equipment. Furthermore, the peasants burned furnishings to fuel the furnace, only adding to their poverty. Secondly, in order to combat disease and other problems in agriculture, the party introduced the Pests Campaign. One of these pests was sparrows, who are crops and generally annoyed the farmers. As such, a bounty was placed on sparrows as they were killed wholesale by the farmers for reward. However, this led to a massive increase in crop-destroying insects, a massive factor in the eventual Great Famine. Now, you'd think that the farmers and local officials would do something once they realized it was all going wrong. But no, party directives incentivized the officials to fulfill quotas and push their locals further, resulting in the famine that killed millions. Story 57. I used to work at Sam's Club in their cafe. Around closing time, we would throw all the food away and start cleaning up. Sometimes the food was so stale we couldn't sell it, so we would close a few minutes early to prevent people from buying up the nasty food. Our cafe manager caught wind of this, took everyone into the back room and screamed at us for closing early. She implemented a new rule that basically dictated that we could not log out of our registers until 8:30 on the dot, and we had to prepare fresh food 10 minutes before closing. So for the next few months, we prepared fresh food just before closing, and maybe 1 or 2 customers would come along. For the most part, we were throwing away more food than before. Our club manager came by and asked us why our inventory was so low every week, and we told him that we had to prepare an extra batch of food every evening that never got bought, and the morning shift people would restock the normal amount of food for the day. He was visibly upset. Our sales were lower than ever, apparently. We were told to stop following this rule immediately. The cafe manager then got into a fight with the club manager, and the next week we were all expecting a new cafe manager. But nope. All of us were given the option of changing clubs or switching to a different position. They were closing the cafe for good. I quit right then and there. Story 58. I was playing youth hockey in the mid-late 90s. Anyone who went through USA Hockey at the time probably remembered that they went with no-touch offsides for a bit. The rule was to eliminate injuries or something, but it was dumb. On a normal offsides, if a player from one team is inside the opponent's blue line and the puck is played by a team across the blue line, the player can't touch the puck or they're offsides. They can go on their side of the line and then skate in after the puck. This is called touching up. USA Hockey, in their infinite wisdom, removed the allowance for touching up. If your team was offsides, you all had to leave the offensive zone and could not re-enter until the other team left their own zone. This caused a number of issues that I saw firsthand. 1. Teams that were up a goal would hold the puck in their zone as long as they wanted, especially if the reffing was bad. 2. South of I-70, the reffing was almost uniformly bad. There was an allowance in the rulebook that let the refs move the faceoff into the defensive zone of a team that committed an egregious offsides. For some refs, picking up and carrying the puck into the offensive zone while your team was offsides was not egregious. For other refs, simply being offsides at all was egregious. On too many occasions, this would occur with the same ref, in the same game with rules applied differently depending on the team. Usually, the home team benefited from this, which led to number 3. I saw more injuries from no-touch offsides in 5 minutes than I ever saw from standard offsides. A couple teams playing before my team got in a brawl where one team down a goal and having the puck be held against them in their opponent's offensive zone just decided to go in and crush someone. First guy hit goes down with a concussion. 2 actual fights break out. One player from Fight A skates off holding his shoulder, and a player from Fight B skates away holding his face with blood streaming from between his fingers. Come to find out that the game had gotten out of hand due to inconsistent reffing benefiting the home team who we were to play the next day. Lovely. USA Hockey finally ditched the rule after a year or two, and my coach threw an actual party for the occasion. Story 59. Ever heard of Walmart's downfall in Germany? One of the least expected reasons is the customer service rules that gave them success in many other countries. In addition to the fact that the German culture is an individualistic culture, German people are assertive and use explicit communication. Therefore, the 10-foot rule, when Walmart employees come within 10 feet of customers, they have to smile, make eye contact, greet the customer, and offer assistance. This was of Walmart seen as fake and not genuine because the employees are strangers, and thus Germans did not appreciate it. The same applies to the idea of greeters in the store. It is not familiar in the German culture, which is neutral, to express emotions in business relations. Therefore, it was really weird for them that a stranger pays them a smile and talks to them during their shopping activity. Another cultural aspect is that German consumers realized that they were the ones who would be paying more because of the guy standing at the door, greeters, which made more unappreciated for a result, and a value-oriented culture like the German culture. Story 60. Back in 2014 or so, the Florida Supreme Court ruled in favor of a Christian group, claiming that they should be allowed to open public meetings with Christian prayer, citing First Amendment rights. Within 2 days, the shenanigans began with city meetings being opened by pagan chants invoking the 4 directions, satanic displays of the fallen angel alongside a nativity scene and the flying spaghetti monster, yes, all in the same place, as well as New Satanic Church handing out the Big Book of Satanisms or something like that, coloring and activity book at public schools. I, for one, thank said Satanists and pagans and the like for reminding the ignorant and short-sighted fools that there was a reason why, in a country that just screams freedom and everyone else, we should stay religion neutral in public forums. As it turns out, among the general public, there's more than one religious practice, and if you're going to give freedom of expression to one, you have to give freedom of expression to all. There's nothing wrong with your beliefs, just don't try to make your beliefs mine. Story 61. My town did a renovation project and made Main Street into a cool hotspot for bars, clubs, and restaurants that has a pretty awesome nightlife. Too long didn't read, bar goers get taxi rides from home and leave their cars in the lot until the next morning. Local businesses complained about all these extra cars in their lots, so town implemented paid parking. Didn't stop anyone from leaving their car there, but now employees and customers had to pay to park. No surprise, they complained about that too, so the town implemented a no parking 4 a.m. to 6 a.m. rule. Bars close at 4, businesses open at 6. This is the dead time when no one has a reason to be there. Idea was that it would provide incentive not to park, and if you did, not to stay. If you did, it gets towed. Problem solved. Right? Well, if you tell bar goers that their car is impounded unless they drive it home, they're just going to drive it home. This led to a spike in drunk drivers in the area. That led to more cops and more checkpoints. Between the costs, threat of impound, and checkpoints, people just started going to other towns where none of those hassles even existed. Just a few years after the revitalization brought it back to life, it's dying all over again. For the first time in years, there's empty shops and places closing down. Story 62. A former place of employment had a trio of rules that backfired spectacularly. The first two were implemented about 6 months before the third, but the effects weren't seen for about a year when customers started going elsewhere and our IT systems started crashing over poorly programmed user databases. 1. No username or email can be reused, period, for any reason at all. Also, to ensure this policy, no user object can ever be deleted, moved to a child domain, graveyard for terminated accounts, or otherwise altered after the employee is terminated. 2. All emails are required to be legal first name, legal last name @company.com. No exceptions. If the email already exists, just add a number at the end of the name. 3. When a field worker's project wrapped up, they are fired unless a new job starts immediately. If the job is 2 weeks out, fire the guy and rehire him in 2 weeks. Taken together, this means that ever Juan Perez, for example, we hired had to have Juan Perez #1 @company.com as their email, and when they were rehired a few weeks later, they got a new address with a different number. In the 4 years I was there, I think the leader was Manny, who was on Manny last name 36 @company.com, and he was the only one with his name we ever hired. Story 63. Working in customer service, 90% of rules backfire because the people making the rules aren't required to actually come down and even see where the rules are being implemented, let alone consider how they affect the people that have to follow them. Example, we had one customer last year raise a huge stink, and to be fair, to an extent, there were things that could have gone better, and corporate overreacted so dramatically that their new rules they came up with regarding how to handle escalated situations created thousands of more complaints in response. The problem was that they wanted us to treat pretty much every contact from a customer as an escalation. Basically, anytime anyone even asked a question, we had to treat it as a complaint, which quickly turned into an actual complaint because people weren't complaining, they were just asking questions. But if we didn't treat it as a complaint, then we would get written up or fired. One missed grievance is grounds for automatic termination. They lessened up after they got sick and tired of fielding all the escalations. Plus, our time per customer shot through the roof, and these companies are always all about the quantity. But technically, the rule is still super vague, so if someone wanted to go and write us up for not treating every question as an escalation, they could. And when I say question, I mean basic questions like, how do I update my phone number? Was supposed to be treated as an escalated situation or else. It was so bad. Story 64. State passed funding that they'd pay to have all trees within 30 feet of the center line of a named road cut down with the idea that it would reduce road maintenance costs in poorer counties. Rural logging community cut winding roads into the woods that were going to be logged and then named the roads. The state then paid the loggers to cut down the trees and then paid the logging company to take the logs. All things they were going to do anyway. Local workers had a good payday, which made the town and employees happy. Logging company was paid to log their own forest, so they were happy. So much of the area was clear cut that I'd get lost driving around. It looked like the moon. A lot of people were upset at the amount of clear cutting and complained to the state. The state sent investigators who realized what was happening. They wanted the logging company to turn over ownership of the roads to the state since they had been named. The state changed the law and never let on why. I'm not sure if the rest of the state knows how one little community took advantage of a little noticed funding program. The logging company and state reached a deal and turned over some land that bordered a state forest. Story 66. There have been lots of cities where trailer parks are being redeveloped into residential subdivisions. For the people living in the trailers, they have to find another place to go, paying moving expenses. But since most parks won't accept older homes, they want to look nice to attract tenants and keep rents high. Sometimes there is no place to go, and the older trailers become worthless. Plus, the people living in trailer homes don't usually have a lot of extra money for unexpected expenses. To solve this problem, one local city decided to pass a law saying that trailer parks that close have to find places for their current tenants to pay to relocate them. As the city went through the formal process required to enact the law, every trailer park owner in town put an application to redevelop so they would be vested under the old law and not have to deal with the costs and difficulties of the new regulations. The city had to abandon the law, since it was going to cause the exact problem it was trying to prevent. Story 67. In the county I live in, my shire, there are 2 schools near the county line. School A, which has a really good reputation, and School B, which isn't that bad but doesn't have anything like the reputation of A. In the UK, which state school you go to is determined entirely by geographical proximity and demand. So naturally, there are loads of housing estates built near School A, entirely so that parents can get their children into it. There's only one snag. School A technically isn't in my shire. It's just over the county line in other shire. Per the standard rules, this doesn't make any difference, but it was a central point of argument for other shire who didn't like the idea of another county taking advantage of their school. They wanted to change the rules so that more folks from other shire could get into School A, but my shire's houses are closer and other shire has less housing near it, so bypassing the rules on catchment to that extent would be difficult. Their eventual attempt was this. Priority for School A would be based on the extra distance, as the crow files, a pupil would travel to go to School B instead of A. Those who could more easily go to B instead would do so. The theory behind this was that although the houses in my shire were nearer to School A, they were also nearer School B, whereas other shires' houses would be further from B even if they were equidistant from A. But that's not what the rule does. No, that rule has some really odd effects. You might need to grab a bit of paper at this point for a bit of geometry. Draw two dots, B above and A below, then draw a line through them and down off the rest of the page. As you go down that line, both A and B get further away from you, but the extra distance between B and A never changes. So in fact, this formula doesn't measure much in distance unless you are actually between A and B, which the vast majority weren't. No, it measures your deflection from the line between A and B, which resulted in a really strange distribution and oddly one that didn't vary with distance. Someone closer to the line but miles away could be chosen over someone further away from the line and nearby. In fact, the road actually next to School A and another shire was minimum priority by this scheme because it pointed towards B. They revised it pretty quickly, but it's a great example of how not knowing your geometry can cause all kinds of issues. Sounds like whoever came up with this plan went to School C. Story 68. Two things with my company. I work for a media advertisement company. One, we are always dead on July 4th. The biggest reason is obviously all the sales and ads were for the days leading up to this holiday. In years past, we were off. One year, the head of marketing changed it so that we had to show up on July 4th. The reason was to show all of our customers that we are a hard-working media group that is open 24/7, no matter the holiday. We constantly told them that we are dead and we will have nothing to do, but of course they never listen. Once the holiday came, nothing, not a single ad or sale. The entire company was dead as a doornail and the higher-ups are freaking out as if they never saw this coming. All of us got paid to sit at our desks and do nothing. 2. Same company, everyone I work with, manager included, are all underpaid. Raises are basically non-existent. So in all, we are really cheap labor for the company. Well, the company was looking into finding an outside source so they can save money. They told us to handle a certain part of the workload and this other source will take care of the rest. They thought they could get a better deal elsewhere. We never said anything to them. We all knew it was going to backfire since we were already dirt cheap to begin with, and knew it would be hard to find a labor even cheaper. Of course, we were right again. Not even 2 months later, they realized that they messed up and it cost them more money. Plus, we had all this extra overtime to undo the damage that they started. Story 69. A couple of sessions back, the Texas legislature passed a law saying that a fire hydrant that wouldn't release water at least 250 gallons per minute had to be painted black. The idea being that firefighters would know if a fire hydrant didn't work. However, a lot of municipalities read this law and said, but what if there's a break in the water line, or what if there are multiple fires at the same time and firefighters try to run water from too many hydrants at once? If that happened, the water pressure would be lower than required. If the hydrants weren't marked as non-functional, we might get sued. And so they painted all their fire hydrants black. So now in those areas, firefighters don't know if a hydrant is painted black because it doesn't work or because a city employee was overly cautious. That's assuming the firefighter can even find the hydrant, since something painted black is not necessarily that easy to see at night. Story 70. I worked maintaining a salad bar at a chain restaurant that very proudly advertised its salad bar. On really busy shifts, like Saturday dinner or Sunday lunch, they'd have 2 people working on it. With so many items and people, we quickly determined that the best way to handle it was to have one person in the kitchen making as many dishes of ingredients as possible, and the other person taking them out as they emptied on the salad bar. At peak times, this would keep up people constantly working and barely keeping up. Well, the boss got a bit upset and told us one person had to stay up front at all times in order to help customers and help the place look maintained. So instead of 2 workers rushing around and struggling to keep the place barely maintained, you'd have one guy just standing by the salad bar and smiling, even as things ran out and people started asking about them. And because the only radios we had weren't clear and picked up the messages of a nearby restaurant, there was no way to tell the person in the back what was missing. Items would run out and there was no guarantee when it would be brought out. We didn't even wait for the boss to get mad at us for not staying at our post and just settled for ignoring his advice. Story 71. When I was in college, I worked in a warehouse managed by, without a doubt, the worst collection of human beings that could possibly be assembled to manage a single thing. There should be a class dedicated to these idiots at Wharton, how to annihilate morale and foster a contemptuous attitude among employees 101. Here's the biggest testament to their uncanny incompetence. Shortly after the beginning of the school year, they announced the 1 hour rule. If you're going to miss a single hour or more of work or more in a given day, your time card will get a NP, non-pay designation. This crapple didn't have paid time off until you'd been there 10 plus years. This went over, as you might have expected, very poorly. The first few weeks, I started noticing how short-handed we were, and I'd hear crap like, well, Mike had to take his daughter to the orthodontist this morning. He would have been in by now, but that effing 1 hour rule kept him home today. Management starts putting the spurs to use because we're not meeting schedule, and of course, we aren't. We are running at 80% manpower on a good day, so they call us in for another announcement. We're thinking they're about to walk back their boneheaded 1 hour rule, right? No, they doubled down on it. Anyone with 2 or more NP designations in the calendar year will be terminated. However, they have a new designation for people subject to the 1 hour rule, AP, adjusted pay. The AP hourly rate, $0. So get this, you need to run your kid to the doctor and you're going to miss a couple of hours of work, right? Cool, go do that. Come to work and work the rest of the 10 hours of your shift for $0 an hour because if you don't, you're going to be fired. Management argued that they could do this because minimum wage laws consider your weekly wages, not daily. This is just hilariously untrue. I remember this one fat idiot manager, let's call him Dan because that's his real name, kept trying to normalize this crap by saying stuff like, there should be no mathematical way this drops your weekly wages below the state minimum wage. Well, this fat idiot ate those words so quickly. A couple weeks after that announcement, a guy who worked on the Rams received his paycheck, and when he did the math, he discovered he did indeed make less than the minimum wage for the hours he had worked. He approached management simply asking to have his pay adjusted up to minimum wage, and they refused. When he protested, they fired him. So what'd this guy do? He sued. I ran into this guy a few years ago and he told me that the settlement was significant enough to pay off his house, buy a new car for him and his wife, pay off all their debts and send his wife back to college. That was so beyond gratifying to hear. And the management team, they walked the 1 hour rule back to its first iteration. Story 72. A dog daycare I worked at got sick of people not cleaning up water bottles after themselves in the back area where the dog kennels and yards were. Solution? Managers banned any water in the back at all. This almost worked until some of us threatened to turn the company in for not allowing half their workers to drink water for up to 4 hours of their 6-hour shift, while having to be on our feet playing with the dogs, cleaning kennels, or running around the whole time in 98-degree temperatures. This rule also didn't last very long, maybe a week or so, before a new one was made. Write your name on the bottle, and whoever's was left overnight got written up. Story 73. My work implemented a smoking ban on the premises because people smoked in company vehicles and out front where customers and clients were. It looks bad, it smells bad, etc. I get it. All the smokers just went across the street and smoked at the gas station. Nothing in the new rules said you couldn't do that. Rather than driving straight to a call, people would pull over several times to smoke, then get back on the road. Our ETAs and our contracts state an hour-and-a-half response time outside of long distance. We try to beat it, but the boss can't complain as long as you made it in that hour-and-a-half. A bunch of people started getting extra overtime. Boss couldn't figure out why. Well, being the supervisor, I saw it all the time. So I informed the boss. He was not pleased, but other than firing otherwise good employees, not a ton he could do. Story 74. I used to work with a young adult with autism, and he had quite the sailor mouth. If you told him something he disagreed with, he'd say, "Are you effing sure?" If you annoyed him, he'd call you an efferhead. It was funny, and he was really creative with it, and did have a super good sense of humor, the swears being just part of it, but obviously not super socially acceptable. The folks in charge of his behavior interventions tried curbing this by implementing a swear jar and having him pay 50 cents for every swear. The problem is this guy came from a well-to-do family and could definitely afford to comply with the swear jar as much as he wanted. At the beginning of every day, he'd prepay for anywhere from 20 to 50 swears and gleefully cuss all day. His swearing was actually reinforced because he made a game out of counting his swears. My favorite example of this, one day he was singing Uptown Funk to himself and then said, "Oh, it's funk," and not the F word, and then proceeded to rapidly drop exactly 25 F-bombs at the top of his lungs. I was fortunate enough to be in the room at the time, and I effing lost it. It's still one of my favorite work stories to this day. Story 75. I work on an extremely busy floor for a for-profit hospital. Being for-profit, corporate dictates that the nurse-to-patient ratio is 1 to 6. Regardless of how sick the patients are, this means we rarely get lunch breaks or even bathroom breaks on a busy day. More than anything, corporate hates paying incremental overtime, meaning clocking out a minute late and getting 15 minutes of overtime. Unfortunately, they also like to add piddly charting requirements that cause more work for the nurses. Corporate decided we had to add 2 forms per patient that are totally unnecessary as the contents of the forms are addressed in other places within the patient's charts. These forms are meant to be filled out at the beginning of the shift, then reassessed at the end of the shift. Our unit director is amazing and kind of loves sticking it to the man. When we pointed out how redundant the new forms were, she said they are mandatory and to complete them, regardless of how much overtime they cause, after nearly every nurse accrued 15 to 30 minutes of incremental overtime, which is double time pay, for 2 weeks, the redundant forms quietly disappeared. Story 76. Random drug testing. I think they were trying to get rid of a couple of specific employees, if you know what I mean. Anyway, first round of tests, they pulled my assistant supervisor guy and a random picker. They both came to me the same day and told me they weren't going to pass the test. My assistant went straight to the owner, explained himself. She told him not to go take the test. We needed him. The only good thing she ever did. Holy crap, did we need him. The other person was going to try to explain himself. He didn't feel his excuse was as good, and when he got to her office, the winner said, "Oh good, I needed to talk to you. We decided we're not going to do the drug testing." She later told us in a meeting, indirectly, almost subliminally, that she didn't care what people did as long as they were able to work. She tried to add so many micromanager type rules too. I don't remember any of those right now though. Story 77. Dog license fiasco. The city of Los Angeles decided to do as Seattle had done just a couple of years before, an attempt to crack down on the number of stray dogs that were being put down by drastically raising the fee for a dog license by tripling it. The extra money would raise funds to house stray dogs longer for adoption. They were going to also do the same for cat licenses, but someone on the committee leaked that to a cat owner association, and they had so many at the meeting, cats were left alone. And just as that had happened in Seattle, the number of dog licenses plummeted. It dropped so badly, they lost money compared to the year before. They certainly lost mine. I refused to pay and changed dog parks to one out of their jurisdiction. About a year later, I moved to a different city, which had reasonable fees, and my Pooch's Outlaw days ended. Story 78. I was trying to get a permit for improving wheelchair accessibility on a building in California. The code is pretty strict to begin with, but this particular city was crazy about what I had to do. We work all over the country, so I'm familiar with a lot of jurisdiction challenges, and I know that California as a state is generally one of the toughest. But this city wanted to be very welcoming to special needs folk and demanded unreasonable changes to existing structures. I found some loopholes and used some other channels to make it work, but in the end it's probably one of the least accessible cities in California because it demands so many exceptionally expensive modifications. Everyone else just gives up and doesn't improve their property at all. Story 79. I worked in an office where the management was very controlling. Everything was unnecessarily rigid, including when people could request vacation time, maximum 1 month in advance. So forget ever traveling and getting a good deal on airfare. Jeez. To the dress code, women weren't allowed to wear skirts that hit above the knee. All the internal policies were also poorly written. The dress code, for example, said, for ladies, footwear, no more than 2 toes may be visible at one time. They were obviously trying to say that peep-toed shoes weren't allowed. Well, this was the workers' one chance to subtly say, shove it to management. So everyone wore peep-toes, but when the boss came by, people would shift their body weight so only 2 toes poked out the end of their shoes. It became an inside joke used to make fun of and undermine management. It got to the point where people started whispering, just two, when the boss walked by. It could have been avoided altogether if the office would have just realized that people don't like to be patronized and controlled for no good reason. Story 80. When I was in the Marine Corps, everyone would once in a while get selected to stand duty. This means you spend a 24-hour shift in a little office in the barracks and walk around and make sure no one does anything crazy. It's boring and it sucks, but you stand a duty with 2 other Marines and sleep in shifts, so there's at least 2 people up at a time. Since you really don't get much sleep if you get any at all, you get the next day off. Or at least half off. The command decided to ask the junior Marines if there are any complaints they had or ideas for making the day-to-day life more efficient. Some Marines complained that they didn't get enough sleep on duty. Big crybabies. The command decided that the Marines could get more sleep if there were more shifts. So more Marines were put on duty at a time so they could all rest more and take more shifts. Problem is, if your rest period was in the morning, you won't get sleep anyways because you're not tired. Also, the frequency that you'd be put on duty was now more. The worst part is, now that everyone had 8 hours of rest, there's no reason to get the next day off. It was frustrating to say the least, but I was at least getting out at the time. Story 81. When I was in active duty, I used to work in airplanes. The flight schedule is very demanding, especially during the height of the Afghan war, so breaking an airplane was frowned upon. Putting massive amounts of band-aids on things was the way to go. Until we almost had a jet go down, the pilot managed to save himself and the jet, and QA, quality assurance, wrote the entire squadron up and the maintenance captain for his pee-pee smacked by the general. The new rule then came into place that if we see something bad, we say something, and down the jets. After breaking my 4th jet, 8 hours after the new rule was implemented, I was pulled into the office by the captain and with a struggling, calm tone he asked me to stop. I told him I was just following his rule and was writing up things that I saw. Turns out I wasn't the only one doing this. Just the first caught, if you will, because over half the squadron jets, roughly 23 if I remember correctly, were put into heavy maintenance for 3 weeks or more. That caused the flight rate to plummet and the captain got fired very shortly after. Story 82. Wells Fargo had a rule of 3x3, or whatever the F they called it, basically getting 3 customers to open 3 new accounts for services every day or week. Every teller sales associate had to meet those goals. Basically, there was rampant fraud from fake accounts, checkings, savings, line of credits, etc. being created by employees, and the line managers turned a blind eye, because anyone not meeting their sales goal was to be fired or punished. The scandal took Wells Fargo down several notches as a retail banking institution. They prided themselves on being the fastest growing retail banking provider and how strong their retail side was. Story time. I remember being in college and the recruiter laughed at how other banks struggled during the bailouts due to their mortgage securitization and the derivative business. Wells Fargo kept saying how their retail business was so strong it was a shining light during the recession. The culture was toxic at Wells Fargo. Instead of taking care of clients, they had a sales mentality. I remember sitting for an interview with a district manager and a manager at Wells Fargo Bank for an outside sales position for a payment processing solution for small businesses. After the interview, I went home and yacked in my own mouth. Mind you, I worked for a tobacco company at the time, and by no means was I Mother Teresa. But gosh dang it, the boiler room interview environment was beyond anything. When the manager called me and offered me a panel interview as a next step, I told him, no thanks. Imagine a bank teller who made $30K a year or less being put through the ringer and forced to do ethically questionable practices for the sake of sales. F that noise, man. Story 83. At my high school, I'm in Norway, so it wasn't called that, but it's the closest equivalent. Students who smoked were allowed to take breaks to do so. Within reason. I mean, I don't smoke, but that's important context for later. I use snus, which for those who are unaware is tobacco, loose or in a small pouch, that you leave under your upper lip. It's kind of like dip, but without the spitting. Anywho, at some point they banned snus in the school because a bunch of first-year dip craps, no pun intended, couldn't be bothered to spit it into a trash can or leave it in the lid on the can, instead leaving it all over the effing place like animals. That was, as I'm sure you can imagine, pretty annoying to those of us who were responsible addicts. How did this rule backfire? Well, smoking was also banned on school premises and always had been. But as I said before, smokers were allowed to go for a smoke now and then, at least by most of my teachers. So it was argued that if they were allowed to do that, we should be allowed to do so too. It was only fair. The thing is, a cigarette doesn't take that long to smoke. Snus can remain in your mouth for 45 minutes to an hour and be fine, depending on the type. So if we wanted to be real jerks about it, which we definitely did, instead of stepping out for a few minutes, we'd be gone for about an hour at a time. I don't know if that rule was ever officially removed, but it didn't take long for teachers to just ignore it entirely, so it might as well have been. Not as exciting as other stories in this thread, I'm sure, but it came to mind, so there you go. Story 84. I worked at a telemarketing company in the late 90s with a lot of other 18 to 25-year-olds. The company chartered a couple buses to take us to a Dodger game one year and allowed everyone to take whatever alcohol they wanted on the bus for the short 90-minute drive to the stadium. Everyone on my bus was crap-faced by the time we got there, as was everyone on the other bus. Some of the guys on the other bus had even exchanged some words that had resulted in minor physical altercations. Then they let us all loose into the stadium, running wild. People were just getting into fights with each other and innocent people just there to see the game. Others were stealing from concession stands, urinating in random places, sitting in the wrong seats, and drunkenly carrying on completely blind to any repercussions. Somewhere around the 6th inning, our entire company was told to leave the premises and never return. I remember the boss being furious the next day, but what I remember most is the mass exodus of people from the parking lot where the buses dropped us off back home to the nearest In-N-Out burger. I could still taste that burger if I think about it. It would probably feel ashamed if the whole thing wasn't so ridiculous. Story 85. Le Pays Grand Gabelle? The gabelle was an extremely regressive salt tax in most regions of France, and in some sectors, every citizen over the age of 8 was obligated to purchase 7 kilograms of salt per year at a fixed, often inflated price, fairly typical of the F the poor attitude displayed in the pre-revolution France. Worse, this salt was not allowed to be used to preserve food, and there were draconian laws against even oversalting cod for transport, for the possibility of smuggling. Repeated violations led to imprisonment or death, and gendarmes could enter homes without warrant or even cause to search for illegal salt. The prices of such a total physical necessity were wildly variable and smuggling was rampant. Of course, government officials, religious figures, and favored areas of the country enjoyed reduced or even non-existent taxes. This and other such abuses of the French poor ended very badly for the nobility. Guys, I'm sorry for the French, okay? I tried. I Googled it and all, but I still failed. Story 86. I've got two. My university operates in trimesters and is located in northern Wisconsin, and it gets very cold. So they decided that they would shorten the first trimester of the year, making it end in late November. So the students would leave the campus for the last week of November and the entire month of December. That way, the administration reasoned they wouldn't have to pay the electric bill to keep the dorms and halls heated and lit during the cold, dark Wisconsin winter. However, they forgot one small detail. They're students that don't or can't go home for the holidays, like international students or students from distant areas of the country. So basically, the university lost money because they had to keep the lights, heating, and almost all university services on anyway, and the tuition and housing bill is less for almost everyone since everyone has a break from classes and most are off campus once the first trimester ends in late November and don't return until early January. And this wasn't just a one-off either. This large winter break continues to this day since the school was too lazy to restore the first trimester to its proper length. So, good for the students, but bad for the administration. Also, same university, in the middle of each trimester, there's a few days where there are no classes, called midterm reading period. The idea is, of course, to use those days to study for midterms. One year, the administration decided to cancel midterm reading period for the whole year. I guess they thought it wasn't needed anymore. In the first trimester alone, we had our first student self-unalivings in a long time, and the average grade dropped quite a bit as well. Midterm reading period was reinstated for the rest of the year and hasn't been touched since. Story 87. In middle school, my school made this rule where, in an effort to decrease tardies in the morning, the teachers would have to lock their doors as soon as the bell rang for first period. The kids who didn't come on time would then be locked out and get detention or an in-school suspension. What made it worse, however, was then the assistant principal and a couple other administrators would walk around the entire perimeter of the school with bullhorns screaming, "Round up!" It was chaos. Kids would literally be banging on the door begging to be let in so they wouldn't get in trouble. Kids would try to sprint outside of the front gates and hop on the fences. People would be sobbing. Eventually, if you were late, you just wouldn't come to school at all to avoid the roundup. It got so bad the school actually got into some trouble because parents started complaining and first periods were now barren. The school backtracked on the rule and eventually said 3 tardies would now constitute a detention and 10 would get you in-school suspension. Story 88. Retail store with multiple departments started making everyone on the sales floor play a game where we took little pre-printed cards and wrote down the price of every item we sold every shift. At the end of the day, the person with the highest sales out of all the departments would win and get a prize, $5 gift card to Starbucks, or just a candy bar. The department with the highest price items is, of course, electronics, but apparently management hadn't taken that into account. Therefore, electronics could sell one item and just win the game for the day. This exact thing happened nearly every day for a month before the box holding the sales note cards mysteriously disappeared, and the game hasn't been mentioned since. Story 89. I was an engineering intern in college. Some upper management made a rule that all of the part fixtures for the different machines were to be color-coded. So the engineers looked down on the machinist. Dumb mistakes on occasions gave the machinist a bad rap. So management wanted to simplify things for them. Let's color code all the fixtures and make a step-by-step guide. Use this color for this part. The guide even had photos. It sounds great, right? Except management didn't run the machines and didn't think much about the process. The machine uses electricity to cut parts, EDM machining, and they had opted to color code the fixtures with anodizing. Anodizing reduces electrical conductivity at the surface. The parts were no longer grounded. The first few parts that were ran were scrapped. It took a bit for someone to figure out why all the machines failed to cut. I think they ended up either grounding the fixtures with a cable, an extra step now, or had to make new fixtures entirely. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our stories of horrific rules that have backfired tremendously. If you guys have any tales that you would like to share that are embarrassing for you, yourself, or your employer, feel free to drop them down below. And of course, thank you for listening.